That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. Today we're going to be talking about accountability. And accountability can be a good thing in the sense that when you elect someone to public office, you send them there to represent you. In fact, this really comes down to why government exists in the first place. And we'll get into that a little bit later on in the program. But also, there's a tendency of human nature that when people are doing things that they maybe shouldn't be doing, they try to avoid accountability. And that is true of people in elected positions of authority as well as anywhere else. So we're going to go into some detail on this and particularly show you why it's necessary for people to demand accountability from those who you send either to the legislative branch or the executive branch. Even in the judiciary, there needs to be accountability. Otherwise, you set the perfect conditions for tyranny to take place and to take hold. Now, to illustrate this, I'm going to start with something that has been on a number of people's minds, and that is the issue of how do we deal with transgender issues in our schools. This was the subject of a raucous school board meeting in Caldwell last month. And in fact, school board administrators finally just dismissed the meeting. They still haven't had their meeting yet to deal with the issue. Now, the Idaho Freedom Foundation reported on this and said the Idaho School Board Association recently urged school districts across the state to follow a new law regarding transgender students' use of the bathroom facilities. Now, that would mean biologically born boys could go into the girls' restroom if they say they identify as a female or identify as a girl because of their transgender status. The law, the ISBA told these districts, mandates transgender students should be allowed to use the bathroom of their identified gender. But the trouble is, no such law exists. And the Idaho Freedom Foundation actually went and got a legal opinion on this, which you can find at their website, idahofreedom.org. Here's the bottom line. The ISBA, instead of citing the law that compels these school districts to make these kinds of accommodations, cited a recent court opinion from the 4th District, ruling that schools cannot deny transgender students access to the bathroom of their identified gender. Now remember, that's not the same thing as law. That's a court ruling that applies certainly to schools within the 4th District jurisdiction boundaries, but Idaho lies within the 9th District boundaries. So from here, we go to Coeur d'Alene, where the sharp eyes of one Matt Edwards, sorry, Matt, I'll get your name right next time here, have pinpointed why this problem exists. And it comes down to a rather sneaky way in which guidelines are treated as policy, which is then treated as law. And it's very convoluted, but it leaves parents and others who are concerned about these kinds of policies because it affects their kids. It leaves them in the dark. So Matt Edwards, and I would encourage you, go to his Twitter account and check out this thread for yourself. It's extremely revealing, and yes, he has the receipts. Non-public internal document reveals Coeur d'Alene School District 271 in Coeur d'Alene does in fact have transgender student guidelines that allow biological males to compete in female sports, require staff to use chosen pronouns, and prevent staff from discussing the issue with parents. It's kind of interesting how that cuts parents out of the mix. Now, he goes on to say, in January, outrage erupted in Caldwell as the school district there was considering adopting the infamous and controversial Policy 3281 dealing with student gender identity and sexual orientation. This one has been pretty well covered. And, you know, the press, at least in Idaho, the legacy press is much on the side of, well, the school districts did nothing wrong. And how could anybody question this? Only angry voices from parents who, don't understand how the world works, are the reason for that uproar. But that's not the case, as you'll see. See, they forget about some of the events that had taken place, for instance, in Loudoun County, Virginia. Do you remember this last year? Parents and community members in Coeur d'Alene remembered the concern in Loudoun County where a transgender student actually ended up raping or sexually assaulting a girl inside a school bathroom under a policy that says, well, this is this boy who identified as a girl can choose whatever bathroom, corresponds with his identified gender or what he identifies as. Well, the Loudoun County schools actually covered up rape. They prosecuted a father who spoke out against it.
And so parents in Coeur d'Alene saw this happening, even though it was on the other side of the country, but said, that is not something we want to deal with. That's a tragedy we would rather avoid if possible. That's not to say every transgender student is a latent rapist, but it's just, there's a reason why we separate biological females and males, and it's not to make transgender people feel like they're not being validated. Since then, a group of concerned parents have been diligent in keeping tabs on what is and isn't allowed with regard to this issue in the Coeur d'Alene School District, combing through district policies and handbooks online, but coming up empty when searching for anything gender identity related. Now, on the one hand, that kind of made them feel relieved. Well, we're not finding anything. However, emails obtained through a records request showed one dated from August 25th of last year from the superintendent's executive assistant, asking the Idaho School Board Association for a model transgender policy, presumably so they could consider it, the district could consider it for adoption, just like in Caldwell. The policy they sent back was policy 3821. That's the one that was being considered in Caldwell as well. But Matt says that's not what caught my eye. It was the admission from the superintendent's office that we have guidelines, but, whoa, guidelines. What are those? Are those different from policies? Well, apparently so, because one difference appears to be that policies are public, guidelines are not. So attached is the transgender student guidelines for administrator reference that the Coeur d'Alene schools have been using. Now, these have been on the books since July 7th of 2014. It's hard to see that, but again, if you go to the Twitter thread, you can see this and click on it and bring it all up in full size. Now, Matt says, comparing this 2014 document to the 2022 Idaho School Board Association policy 3821, they are strikingly similar. They are. I mean, it's like cut and paste similar. Participation in gender segregated activities, including sports, staff instructed to utilize name and pronouns, keeping information from parents, even student ID consistent with chosen identity. Due to how much the LGBT community demands change with lightning speed, the restroom and locker room policy went from accommodating trans students with private facilities in 2014 to full-blown red carpet into the opposite sex's facilities in 2022. Proof of the slippery slope. Now, the main headline is this. Parents with concern over policies such as 3281 have assumed that since it wasn't in place in Coeur d'Alene, there was no talk of installing it, that they didn't need to worry about it. Coeur d'Alene was safe. But instead, Matt says with these similar guidelines existing for almost 9 years, that means parents were denied informed consent, even if they had been asking about it for years. Parents were not aware that their children were attending school under these guidelines because they aren't publicly available. Well, that kind of changes things, doesn't it? He says this is a serious issue because for 9 years, diligent parents who did basic research of the school district on their website as they vetted where their child would be attending school would never have come across the guidelines. In fact, current and past Coeur d'Alene board members that he spoke with told him they didn't even know the guidelines were something the district had. They weren't part of an existing policy that's readily available, which begs the question, so what other guidelines does the district operate under that also aren't public? Makes you think. In 2014, the school board was mired in the controversy as they attempted to #add the words, a decade-long campaign of the LGBT crowd to seek protections for gender identity and sexual orientation in the Human Rights Act. Now, during the April 2014 monthly meeting, hundreds of people showed up to the meeting and dozens spoke during a 2-hour marathon of public comment. In fact, the entire meeting lasted over 5 hours, with the board ultimately tabling the issue. But watch what they did. 3 months later, the transgender student guidelines were slipped in among a laundry list of other actual policy items passed by the board 5-0 in a single vote. They were not looked at one by one. They were not debated one by one. And you'll also note, it's hard to see, but down there at the bottom, they've underlined transgender guidelines for admin reference. There's no policy number associated with this. Guidelines are not the same as policy, but they sure seem to carry some of the same weight as policy. Now, Matt says, I spoke with a former board member who was on the board that approved those guidelines in 2014 and said they never knew those guidelines were there. In fact, they were shocked to learn that this happened. So the current board has it within their power to do something about it. He says, I spoke with a current board member who not only reiterated that guidelines were something they weren't aware of, but now is actually looking to draft a policy that can address this issue and be in line with protecting students. Holy cow. Somebody got taken. Somebody was fooled. And sadly, it sounds like it was the parents that were taken for a ride on this one. Now, Matt goes on to say, we can't afford to adopt policies that enable potential mentally unstable predators to take advantage of these rules in order to harm other students by disguising themselves as female. You notice where he's pointing the finger? He's not pointing them just at transgender here and saying they're the predators. There are predators who do this. California had a very recent case of a day spa where some guy was walking around with an erection in front of women and girls in the locker room because he was transgender. He's also a convicted sex offender. So the point here is stuff like this does open the door to predators. Coeur d'Alene is not immune. Also, Matt says we should not be destroying the dreams and ambitions of young female athletes by allowing biological males to dominate female competitive sports. He says this is a national issue that must be dealt with. I finally do see the war on women. And he says the real villains in all of this are those working at the Idaho School Board Association. They are full-blown leftist activists who've been working behind the scenes to push our public school system toward adopting woke and dangerous policies, another swamp that needs draining. And I like this too. I like that he included this. On a personal note, our girls and boys deserve better. Please pray to God we can help deliver them from evil. As for children who truly suffer from gender dysphoria, there needs to be more attention paid to treating this illness and not through hormone therapy and surgery. And of course, there is a hormone therapy and surgery bill that would prohibit those kinds of things being done to minors, making its way through the state legislature right now. To the howls and the cries of the press, among others, that how could you deny health care? I know they're looking at it through a very narrow ideological blinder. That's, you can't look at this as anything other than, you have to do what we say, and only the woke way can be accommodated here. But there's a broader picture. And the broader picture is, what are you introducing to these young minds? And it also begs the question, too, why all this emphasis on bringing sexuality and sexualized behavior in front of children as young as possible? I know the standard excuse is because parents don't do a good enough job of teaching them sex ed. And it's the parents' responsibility. It's not yours. And I don't know any nicer way to say this. They're not your kids. So if you start showing a little too much interest, particularly a sexualized interest or an interest in introducing them to graphic materials, pornographic illustrations, demonstrations of, how to use sex toys and things like this. Again, we're talking children. We're not talking someone who's at an age of consent where they can make up their minds for themselves and decide if that's something that they want to be a part of. Yeah, you're going to catch some stink eye from people who don't really trust your motives and want to know why you're doing it. But the worst part is it's being done with the blessing of people in positions of authority like the Idaho School Boards Association, and it's being done in the dark. This illustrates why there really is no way you can sit this out, okay? There's no neutral corner where you can sit and just kind of watch everything go on while you eat popcorn. You have got to be a citizen lobbyist. Now, that doesn't mean every single issue that comes before the legislature or before a school board or your city council or county commission is something that you need to be, right there front and center and weighing in on. But surely you can identify some of the issues that would matter to you enough that you would be willing to spend the time and inconvenience of becoming better informed and understanding the system. And this is particularly true of the legislative system. How bills become introduced into law, the process by which they even become a bill in the first place. I attended a meeting that was hosted by the Idaho Freedom Foundation back in December of last year. And it was kind of a legislative boot camp, a legislature 101 class for anybody who was interested in how bills become law. And I have to admit, I thought I understood the basic process, but I was only scratching the surface. I had no idea all the different rules and different procedural hoops that have to be jumped through just to get a bill considered, much less printed and then, introduced for debate and amended and voted on and passed through the legislative process. It can be very complicated, and there's a lot of power play that goes on there. That's the nature of politics. Not saying it's good or bad. It happens, and it happens on the regular. But the bottom line here is you can't just be an interested bystander. You have to have skin in the game because it's affecting you, it's affecting your kids, and it's something that cannot be trusted to those people in authority.
Otherwise, why would they be doing things in the dark? Why would they be doing things that are not open and transparent? Now, we're going to talk a little bit about openness and transparency here. And in the guise of a former state senator, her name is Mary Souza. And she has really she's got quite a thing for the Idaho Freedom Foundation. And, it's interesting. She says she voluntarily stepped down from her Senate seat. Maybe she read the writing on the wall that she just wasn't going to be supported by those who were, either running the convention in her area, or she didn't have the support of party members, but she stepped down and now she's calling herself uncanceled and unfiltered. And by gosh, she's coming back. And there's a tinge of sour grapes to this, but there's also kind of a powerful lesson in looking at the things that cause her to take umbrage. She sat down recently for an interview with the ever smug Brian Holmes from KTVB. And if you take a good gag suppressant beforehand, you could probably make it through the whole interview. But they're in her safe space with the comforting, ideological embrace of a fellow traveler like Brian. She spilled her guts about how, this was, I'm such a victim, and people were grading me on how I was voting as a legislator, and they were grading the bills and so forth. In fact, let me share a couple of excerpts of what her complaints were. This is from her column in the Coeur d'Alene Press. She says, I have the inside scoop on the Idaho Freedom Foundation because I've, worked with them over the years. I've seen what they've done in the legislature. And she says they started back in 2009 with the noble intention of helping beleaguered legislators who have little staff and even less time to research issues. IFF offered information, ideas, and support. Now, I have to point out here, look, I know they're an easy target, at least for legacy media, but if you haven't been to idahofreedom.org, you can very quickly assess for yourself whether these are people just playing at power and just, trying to get a slice of the pie when it comes to power, or if they take seriously the research and policy analysis that they do. I've taken the time to read it for myself, and I've made up my mind. I would encourage you to do the same at the very least, so you can say, yes, I've looked at this myself and not just had to take Mary Souza's word or Brian Holmes's word for it, because it's just possible those two might have an agenda. Now, Mary takes umbrage because in the following years, she says the IFF has the increased influence and control over compliant elected officials. The focus of IFF changed. How so? Well, she says they began analyzing proposed bills. Think tanks do that, but okay. Then they stepped even further and began scoring bills with a plus or minus number. Again, very standard for think tanks within the nonprofit sector to do this. This is what public policy institutes are about. They look at various policy issues and they will grade them on, does this, for instance, advance the cause of private property or personal freedom or free markets, or does it take away from it? So scoring it is not necessarily a bad thing. And then this is what really irked Mary was, in a major move to gain control, in her words, they started giving letter grades to legislators. If you don't obey the IFF and vote on bills the way they tell you, you'll be treated like a middle school student. She got a B+, so she must be great, but he got a C-, so he must be a bad legislator. Is that what you want for your elected officials? And if so, isn't it important to know who is grading and how they do it? I don't see any problem whatsoever with evaluating and grading and holding accountable for their actual votes and their actual behavior. Look, politicians love to talk. And I don't think I'm painting with too broad a brush when I say politicians are notorious for saying whatever they need to say in order to get elected, and then doing whatever they need to do to keep the financial support and, the lobbyist support that will keep them in power. That's a pretty amoral proposition. So to look at their actions and to measure them against a matrix, and it will vary from public institute to public policy institute, it's going to be different for each one. But with the Idaho Freedom Foundation, they're pretty clear on what their goals are. And I will share those with you in just a few moments. So why would a person who is representing people, who is operating in the interests of the public, why would they be afraid of being graded? Why, it's not demeaning them. That's why they were sent there. They're not sent there to become a rock star and to have people tell them how great they are and how right they are about everything they do. They are there to represent the people for whatever district they've been elected to represent, and they need to be held accountable for how they represent those people. All right, moving on. Mary says, please know that when the IFF analyzes proposed legislation, it is only from the bill itself right after it is printed.
Well, that's the part that's going to be debated about going into law. So I would say that's where they want to put their focus. What do the words on paper actually say? That's how laws operate, right? You don't get to protest, when you're in court and you've been charged with breaking a certain law. You don't say, well, in the legislative debate leading up to this being passed and then signed by the governor, this point was brought up. Nope, it's what's written on the paper. That's what counts as law. And so for analyzing that and grading it, that's exactly where you need to start. And I like how she says they use a short checklist based on their quasi-libertarian beliefs of no government, no taxes, no public schools. See, to the statists, those are three of the worst things you could suggest. The only other thing you might throw in there that would really cause them a pure fit of apoplexy is, and no public roads. That's just being mean at that point. No government, no taxes, no public schools. No, I've never seen anything on the IFF's website or heard otherwise from them that is their goal. Their goal is to have accountable government, meaning limited government, the lowest possible taxes to run that limited government. And as far as public schools go, if the public schools are failing, well, it's time to start looking at alternatives. But even the Idaho Freedom Foundation acknowledges with school choice bills like the one currently making its way through the legislature, some people are still going to find that the best choice for them. But it's the statists, Republican and Democrat alike, that seem to have that one-size-fits-all mentality, and nothing can differ from it. Okay, it's a very extreme viewpoint she's trying to portray, but it's not based in reality. She says this method does not include a reasonable cost-benefit method that is typical in business decisions and factors in future impacts. But that's exactly what they're doing. They're looking at what are the future costs going to be down the road, not just what's the intended, the ultimate immediate intended consequence, but what is this likely to do if we allow this to pass, and what kind of costs will it impose on the tax-paying public down the road? Those are the questions that wise policymakers are going to make. Now, Mary says, well, if the bill spends $100, it gets a negative score from IFF, even if the bill saves the state $100,000 down the road. Okay, I'm going to pull the old Jim Jones trick here and say, give me an example. Show me where there's a bill that equates with, well, spend $100 here and we'll save $100,000 down the road. There's a lot of unnecessary spending. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some unnecessary spending that the governor strong-armed through here recently. But what she's describing here is simply accountability for elected officials. She talks about Wayne and Brent. Brent is, I believe, actually the chair of the Idaho Freedom Foundation. Wayne Hoffman is the president. Wayne and Brent want more power and control. Now, this is her armchair psychiatrist analysis, not more accurate information. This is a bold statement, I know, but she says, look at their actions and their process. It speaks volumes. IFF typically scores their targeted printed bills before the actual legislative process in committee and on the floor. So the score of the bill influences the votes of the legislators. Again, what's wrong with that if the process of scoring that bill demonstrates, does it grow government? Does it increase the cost of government? Does it decrease the amount of freedom that the average citizen is going to have? They are perfectly within their right to do so. In fact, actually, all of us have a duty to be scrutinizing this. You just have an organized group that's helping to make that possible. But listen to this disdain she has for those who likewise take a principled approach. And she's talking fellow legislators. And IFF's obedient legislators have a list of the bills and scores with them in their committees and on the floor. In fact, she says, I've seen this list taped to the desk of some legislators in the House. No need to think for yourself in your district. Just vote the way you are told. Okay, if that really is the case, what's the enforcement mechanism? How does IFF enforce this you will vote as you are told mentality? That's a pretty strong claim. It would be nice to see if it's something that she could back up. Now, she does conclude by saying, please remember, Idaho has 35 legislative districts, each with 1 senator and 2 House members. Every district has different issues, problems, and priorities that should influence the votes of those legislators representing our citizens. There is rarely just one correct vote for all of the 35 areas of our state. But IFF believes they have the only answers. The problem, Mary, is that you are forgetting that government is government. And regardless of where you are in those 35 districts, there are things that are proper for government to do, and there are things that are improper. And if the Idaho Freedom Foundation is holding legislators accountable for any acts that they engage in that create unnecessary or improper or overuse of government, they're well within their right to do so. That's actually a good thing. In fact, let's turn to the Idaho Freedom Foundation and see exactly what are they about? What do they stand for? From their website, Idaho Freedom Foundation gives a voice to the voiceless, the people who don't have the means, the time, or the wherewithal to take on the special interests, which include labor unions, the government bureaucracy, or businesses that seek a handout. We hold lawmakers accountable when they say one thing and do another, when they promise conservative leadership but vote to expand government, support special interests, or make it harder for Idahoans to get ahead and stay ahead. Imagine what would happen if Idaho were to have the lowest taxes, the best schools, the least regulatory burden, and the least dependency on the federal government of any other state. Imagine what might happen if local people who know and love Idaho the most were in charge of our public lands. What if, instead of adding people to the government welfare rolls and entitlement programs, Idaho's charities, churches, and communities pitched in to help lift people from poverty? Our research, journalism, education, and advocacy dovetail to help Idaho policymakers make better decisions rooted in conservative principles so that Idahoans will be better off. Let me give you an example, too, of some of the pressure that's brought to bear on legislators, not by the Idaho Freedom Foundation or any other public policy institute, but within the political machine itself. Listen to what Heather Scott says about the recently passed launch bill that Governor Little was championing. And ask yourself, does the governor appear to think that those legislators work for him or for the people? You decide.
Some of the tactics used to promote this bill. All of us were requested our cell phone numbers not too long ago, a couple weeks ago. And those numbers from the governor's office, the governor has said this is his, or the man from the second floor has said this is his bill. But I do know legislators that have been called up on this bill to discuss this bill with the man on the second floor. I think that's inappropriate. I think the way that this went through committees was inappropriate. And so I don't like those kind of tactics to get good legislation passed. If it's good, it should pass on its own merits. But I'm not willing to fund corporations and colleges at the expense of my taxpayers and my districts. And I would encourage you, I'm guessing the people that sent you here, they didn't send you here to help support corporations. They sent you here to help get more money in their pockets because many of the people in this state are struggling.
Yeah, that sounds like could be some strong arm tactics at work there. So, is it only legitimate when government is doing that? But again, it comes down to the question, who do those legislators work for? They work for the people. And that's where they need to be focusing their attention. I think it was Senator Scott Herndon who earlier had made the comment of, I don't work for the House, or I don't work for the Senate Majority Leader. I don't work for the Lieutenant Governor. I don't work for the governor. I work for the people who sent me to represent them in the Senate. And that was considered radical. That was considered, whoa, wow, it's kind of a controversial thing for him to be saying. But that's the essence of what representative government is all about. And I'm going to throw out a quote here from Patrick Henry just because it needs to be said, that government is no more than a choice among evils has been a standing maxim for ages. Patrick Henry uttered these words during his speech in the Virginia Ratifying Convention in June of 1788. Look, it is a necessary evil. Government can be a decent servant when it is kept limited, when its upper limits are strictly defined and strictly enforced. But it becomes kind of a fearful master when we allow it to slip beyond its controls. And that's exactly what we have been doing for far too long. So rather than joining in the crowd and reviling those who are standing up for your personal freedoms, your property rights, your free market ability to get out there and pursue happiness in the most productive way possible, maybe take the time to get to know them a little bit better yourself, and you might just be surprised to find out that they were on your side all the time. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is in